Good morning, everybody, and welcome. My name is Polita Clark. I'm an associate editor at the Financial Times, and I'm delighted to be here for a panel discussion on a topic that really goes right to the heart of COP28. Is the Paris Agreement working or not? We have a wonderful panel here to discuss this. Governor Zhou Qiaoshuan is the longest-serving governor of China's central bank, People's Bank of China, until his departure in 28. He's been heavily involved in greening the financial system work. Lord Nicholas Stern is the author of the eponymous Stern Review on the economics of climate change, and Mr. Bo Li is a deputy managing director at the IMF. Unfortunately, Kristalina Georgieva is unable to be with us this morning. Now, we are going to frame this discussion with a video that is going to be running through some of the key points on some really interesting IMF analysis that has been done on this very question of whether the Paris Agreement is working or not. So here's the video now.
Salle, je vois que la réaction est positive, je n'entends pas d'objection. L'accord de Paris pour le climat est accepté.
December the 12th, 2015 was a pivotal moment. There was a sense of progress, of hope and ambition. The US President Barack Obama said at the time, the Paris Agreement establishes
the enduring framework the world needs to solve the climate crisis.
At its core, the Paris Agreement establishes a pathway to mitigating and adapting to climate change in a fair way. To limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, ideally to 1.5 degrees, the idea was that all countries will cut emissions, but developed countries would move further, faster, and provide finance and technology to developing countries. At the time, it was recognized that ambition was not sufficient to achieve 2C, let alone 1.5C, but that ambition would be raised gradually over time. But is this framework working? To answer this, we need to look at the national emissions targets in the Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs as they're called. To do that, we can use the model that we developed with the World Bank called the Climate Policy Assessment Tool, or CPAT. This allows for the quantification of emissions targets and of climate ambition. So here's the good news. Our key finding is that the Paris Agreement is making progress. Since 2015, the NDCs have become more stringent. However, we need to see significantly more mitigation ambition and action in this decade. Specifically, we need to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 25 to 50% below 2019 levels by 2030. But globally, current targets only achieve about an 11% cut in emissions. So how do we close this gap in an equitable way? Our proposal is to have all countries reduce emissions versus business as usual, depending on how wealthy they are. Most countries would then raise their ambition, but high-income countries would cut emissions by more than middle or low-income countries. We can compare country targets to what's needed for different temperature goals. As you can see, there is a lot of variation between countries, but some patterns can be identified. Firstly, very few countries are in the range of about 2C, and no country is currently ambitious enough to achieve 1.5C. High-income countries are generally more ambitious than, say, upper middle-income countries, and as a collective have become much more ambitious since 2015. Secondly, upper middle-income countries have raised their climate ambitions somewhat, but overall are further from what's needed for 2C and 1.5C than high-income, lower middle, and low-income countries. Scaling up climate ambition globally is therefore crucial. But ambition is not nearly enough. Another recommendation we make is to accelerate implementation through complementary agreements between countries. This could include an agreement on minimum carbon prices or other measures with equivalent outcomes. We also need to drastically increase mitigation investment. Global investment in energy needs to increase sixfold by 2030. On flows of finance, developed countries aim to mobilize $100 billion in climate finance to developing countries by 2020, but unfortunately are likely to meet this target late. Lastly, we need much faster development and diffusion of low-carbon technologies such as electric vehicles, heat pumps, green steel, and others. So overall, progress has been made since the 2015 signing of the Paris Agreement. But to mitigate climate change, we need much more ambition and action in this decade. But identifying and quantifying gaps is one thing. Finding the political will to close them is another altogether.
All right, so I think that frames it very well, that we have seen this very pronounced progress in countries such as China when it comes to green energy growth in particular. But then probably even in China itself, dare I say, certainly in other countries, one of the key barriers we have is political will. Governor Zhou, can I ask you, in China itself in particular, what would you say is needed to overcome the barriers to moving even faster, as the IMF analysis suggests is required?
Okay, thank you, Teresa. Very good question. I think in China we have some strengths in developing green renewable energy, especially in terms of photovoltaic, the wind farms, electric vehicles, and energy storage. But however, for reaching the Paris Agreement, for reaching 1.5 degrees, China has not yet changed into a very necessary track. First is that we are going to reach the peak of emission before 2030, but we haven't yet worked out the specific number of total emission of CO2. So there has been some of debate domestically, but I say that we must accelerate to determine that's the number. And according,
you mean the precise amount of CO2 emissions?
Yeah. Plus some of other GHGs.
Right.
So according to that, we could work out the roadmap and the annual quota for the allowance of emission. So China already set up the carbon market, both compulsory market and also voluntary market. But without the specific annual total quotas, so the market seems not yet play a normal role we expected. So,
and I mean, that goes to the point about political will, because some analysts say that the reason that China's carbon market price is relatively low is because the coal industry and other fossil fuel interests really would prefer that the market were designed in that way rather than in a way which would induce a higher carbon price. Is that analysis correct, do you think?
In my mind, I think that the obstacle is not merely came from traditional fossil fuel producers. It's merely that people may argue whether that's a stricter total amount requirement or the quota may create the problem for that's the daily life of Chinese resident.
Right, which all countries really face. I mean, that is the problem. And Lord Stone, maybe I can ask you then. We've seen these really interesting reports coming out recently, studies, academics' work actually, just in the last month or so, suggesting that greenhouse gas emissions may actually peak this year, which would be in line with what the IPCC says is necessary in order to keep the 1.5 degree limit within reach. If that happens and greenhouse gas emissions do actually peak and start falling from this year, that's quite transformational, isn't it?
We should have peaked greenhouse gas emissions some time ago. So given that, the optimal time to peak is now, right? The question is how fast it will fall. And so there's a difference between a turning point, and I think we're quite close to a turning point in emissions, and a tipping point. And we really need a tipping point. We need them to come down very quickly. One important optimistic feature of these last years, and Paris was very important for this, was the very rapid fall in prices of solar and wind-generated electricity, of electric cars, of storage, and so on. So whilst we're only at a turning point or close to in emissions, we may be at a tipping point in terms of technologies. And that's extremely important. The clean is cheaper than the dirty across about 30% of emissions already. And you might think of that as a Paris effect, because why did all that technology move? Because we saw that different picture of the future.
Oh, isn't it also because China has made such extraordinary strides, particularly in electric cars, that we're now seeing some relatively affordable electric cars for sale in places like the EU, which doesn't really impress the EU very much. But anyway, it does if you're trying to buy a cheaper car in Europe. But anyway, I mean, isn't it?
No, China is out in front. But why is China out in front? Because it thinks about and has seen this different future, and is ready to invest in it, and has been investing in it. China is investing about 200 gigawatts a year now in renewable electricity, and that will rise. 200 gigawatts, the whole of the UK capacity is 80, right? So 200 gigawatts is enormous. But the reason that has come about is because this different vision of the future that Paris gave, and that has led to a very clear cut in technology costs and advances in technology. That's a very important positive out of Paris. But, you know, we're probably going to have emissions at the end of this decade, something similar to emissions at the beginning of this decade, without a strong acceleration. And the reason...
So you think it's more likely that they will flatten out and just dip down slightly, but not really go down quickly?
If you think of a curve that was there at the beginning of the decade, and it comes up, and it peaks a little, and it comes down a little. So the peak would be in this decade, but the fall doesn't look anything like as fast. And that's why the conversation has to be about acceleration, about structural change. And the most important element in that acceleration for me will be the understanding that this is actually the growth story of the 21st century. This is not about burden sharing. This is not so much about who does the most here. Of course, it matters what everybody does. But the key thing is that people grasp through investment and structural change this new growth story. So it's not some kind of spitting contest between environment over here and growth over here. The investment in these new technologies will be the driver of growth. But it involves structural change, and it involves dislocation. And that is something which is
Mr.
very
Lee
important.
actually on that point. It's a very good point. So, I mean, Mr. Lee, from the IMF's perspective, what would you say are the main barriers to shifting the political will pendulum, if you like? What is the main political problem that the IMF faces when it is trying to encourage greater capital flows into greener investments?
Thank you, Pelita. I think from our perspective, what we see, there are a number of barriers, of course, to first, in terms of, there are two gaps, right? One is ambition gap, one is the implementation gap, and we see both gaps. The ambition gap part is related to what you said, political will. We see that, you know, in some countries, they feel that politically it's not feasible, or it's politically costly to introduce carbon pricing, for example, or some equivalent measures. In terms of the implementation gap, it's something different. It may not be political will, it's more like how to find the right policy mix, how to find the right approach to work together to achieve the already announced NDC. So we need to address both gaps. But specifically in terms of climate finance, we see at least three barriers how to scale up climate finance for especially developing countries, because that's where we see the biggest shortfall. And the first barrier, what we see is the policy environment, because we need to help developing countries to develop a policy framework, a policy environment that is conducive to climate investment. So that's the first. The second is capacity constraint, because we see that a lot of developing countries, they don't have a pipeline of projects. And we need to help them. International community to need to help developing countries, including some emerging markets, to develop a pipeline. That means they need to have the capacity to design the policy, to design the projects, to implement the projects. And the third, we think the barrier is what we perceive as the market failure, where there is too much risk for private investors to come in many developing countries. The sovereign risk, the FX risk, all those risks, we need to figure out how public sector can support, including international community, to support the de-risking.
This is something that has been discussed for many, many years, particularly when it comes to, say, the cost of capital. So if you want to basically borrow some money to build a wind or a solar farm in many emerging developing markets, it's going to cost you up to twice, sometimes 3 times as much as what it's going to cost in an OECD country. Yeah. And we've been talking about this for a long, long time now at meetings like this, at COPs successively. It seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, it does seem to me as though not much change has occurred. And that's a fundamental problem that we have, and we've been talking about it for many, many years. Is there any sign that it is going to improve? Is there any country anywhere where we're seeing any sign of improvement? And why? I'll go in order.
Let me say a few words on that.
Okay.
The good news is that the cost of renewable energy has been substantially declined. Something in the past we say it's maybe impossible for the investor, for the financial sector to finance those projects. Now the gap is becomes smaller and smaller.
Right, so because the cost of the equipment has come down so much, the fact that the cost of capital is higher is...
Equipment, technology, and engineering, I mean the installation and the operation, which is also take a significant part of the operation.
Right.
But in case that's a developing country, the poor country started to use the carbon market and create carbon credit. And to have the carbon market to compensate that's remaining gaps between the operation and the investment cost, I think it's become more feasible.
Okay.
Such as that in China, because there's some of fiscal incentive and central bank's monetary policy support to provide a very few percentage of additional compensation for the cost. Then
that's within China.
That's we see the wind farm, the solar energies, and the electricity energy storage could develop in recent years very fast. Yep. So, in my mind is that we still have a gap. We need to have financial policies to support, but gap now it's I think manageable.
Okay, interesting, Lord Stern.
Yeah. The problem for developing countries is intense, but I do think the solutions, responses are here now in terms of design and have to be implemented. And let me just illustrate. Africa has a real chance now of an approach to growth and development, which is very different from the dirty, destructive models of the past. But it needs strong infrastructure investment, particularly in energy and electricity, in renewables. Now, renewables are already cheaper for electricity production in Africa for cost of capital of 6-7%, but not for 20%. And that's what so many African countries have to pay. So how do you get the 20% down to the 6 or 7% will be a critical element in Africa's ability to follow that new growth model. Now, I've been part of two big studies that have tried to propose solutions to this, and they're both published this year. The first was the G20 report on the reform of the MDBs, where we argued that the private sector can and will come to those investments with the right kind of investment environment, institutional policy structures, but provided that that risk is shared and reduced. And for that to happen, the MDB's lending will have to triple. I mean, we've gone very carefully over the numbers and so on. But the MDB's lending will have to triple, much greater use of guarantees, much greater use of equities.
Does that effectively mean you've got to recapitalize the World Bank, for example?
Yes, for that to happen, you will have to have a commitment to recapitalize.
Yep. By about what sort of numbers are we talking about?
Well, I mean, they're going to need enough capital to triple. So you know, they probably have to double their capital, but that's extremely cheap to do. I mean, the total paid in capital to the World Bank, I think over time has been about $70 billion, and they've lent about 800. You know, the actual numbers involved for the member countries to put in are really quite small in relation to the kicker.
If Mr. Banga was here right now, you would be saying you should be preparing to ask your shareholders.
Yeah, but I would start with what you need to do, which is to triple the lending and to use much more guarantees and equity and so on, and then show that in order to do that over time, because something you can do quite quickly, but over time that will require a capital increase.
Yeah.
You've got to start with what it was you want to achieve, how you're moving towards it now, and then recognize that the capital increase would be necessary. Yep. We've got a similar argument in the report, which was co-chaired by Vera Songwe and myself, where Amar Bhattacharya is a key player and executive secretary. We published one for the COP last year, which actually set out these numbers. And we've just published another one, which will be launching on Finance Day on December the 4th, looking at the practicalities of how you actually increase these flows from the MDBs, how you work with the private sector, because it has to be private sector led in many cases, in order to really get the investment going.
So the IMF's obviously got a different mandate, but have you got advice in your report for the IMF?
Yes.
Yes. Let's hear what it should be and whether
because a very big part of the risk that are involved that's driving up the interest rates is macro and currency risk. Macro and currency risk.
Yep.
So there's lots that you can do, and the IMF does do, but needs to do much more because all this has to be expanded, is managing that, particularly currency risk and macro risk.
Okay, well, Mr. Lee, how's that work going? I know you've already been focusing on it.
But sorry, Peter, it's investment. That's what has to be at the centre of all this. This is the reason that we haven't cut emissions, because we haven't invested enough of the right things.
Yes. Well, I'm interested to know, I mean, obviously we've seen some very interesting moves in the last 2 years at the IMF, not least the setting up of this Resilience Sustainability Trust, using SDRs for climate change, which is absolutely revolutionary. If you'd thought that was going to happen 3 or 4 years ago, really everybody would have said you were slightly mad. But it has actually started to happen. But more needs to be done. So what's going to be happening next?
Yes, thank you very much. Just quickly, 2 points. First, I very much agree with Nick that a lot of the risk in developing countries are macro risk. That is the sovereign risk, the currency risk. And we are the macro institution. So we are the macro lender, and we are supporting countries to have the proper macro policy, and we help countries to build the kind of policy capacity, fiscal policy, financial policy that can conducive to a green transition. So we regard ourselves as a natural player in this space. That's why we introduced not only the RST in the last several years, we also introduced the our surveillance, our annual surveillance of the major emitters. We talk about mitigation policy. We also incorporate surveillance into the climate vulnerable countries in terms of adaptation policy. And so we incorporate those mitigation and adaptation policy in our annual annual surveillance of all the countries in the world to help them to build resilience from a macro perspective. And also in terms of capacity building, we have green PFM, that means green public financial management. We have CPMA, climate public investment management. So we have a number of CD tools now helping countries to incorporate climate into their macro policy framework. So these are also become part of our standard kind of capacity building tools. And finally, come back to the RST in terms of our lending.
Just to explain that, we, we shouldn't
RST.
be using these terrible acronyms.
It's a resilience and sustainability trust. And we use
which
that.
Which is made up of special drawing rights.
That's right. We ask our well-to-do members to recycle the RST, the SDR that we distributed 2 years ago as a new kind of, not a new, additional international reserve assets.
Yeah.
So
So
countries
it's not
like
cash, it's not money.
Yeah.
It's
countries like France, Germany, Japan, even China, they recycle part of their SDR holding back to us into that trust, and we lend to developing countries and vulnerable middle-income countries to support their climate transition. And in that process, we we regard ourselves also as a macro de-risker, because we talk about de-risking, right? We de-risk, but we de-risk from the macro perspective, because many of the risk, as Nick said, is macro risk. And we help them to build a sound macroeconomic framework. We help them to incorporate climate into their macroeconomic policy and financial policy. And we help them to build capacity. All this, we think, is part of the de-risking.
Yeah.
But we de-risk from the macro, not at the country level. And MDBs, they can also help de-risking, but they de-risk at the project level and at the program level.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I want to open it up to the audience, so because I know we have a lot of knowledgeable people in the audience. We do have some roving microphones, so if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand, and if you could just identify where you're from and give us your name as well, that would be great. Thank you. We have a gentleman in the third row and the gentleman in the first row.
Hello. Hi, good morning. Thank you guys for the brief explanation. My voice clear? Yeah. Okay, let me introduce myself. My name is Luqman. I'm actually from Chad, Republic of Chad. So basically, you know, we keep listening always the same repeated investment in climate change, investment of renewable energy, so on, so on, so on. But, I mean, like in reality, there's nothing, literally nothing. We just keep hearing the same thing, and still there is no any, let's say, like, because, you know, as well known, energy is always equal to development. If there is no energy in any specific country, nothing. We're just going to see still the people are suffering, you know, not going any forward. So the gentlemen who's sitting here, like any one of you guys, like what achievement can be done? Is there like any sort of putting any force on the governments in order to do this thing, like, you know, by force or something, or because, you know, even if any country or any association try to help, still there's the bureaucracy or putting obstacles in order not to let things go forward, you know. And I have seen many examples, even I was involved in. They were saying, no, you know, we need you to at least provide us something to let things go forward, and we cannot. So I just need any one of you guys just to give the answer. Thank you.
Lord Stern, I'm going to ask you, because you were talking about on the ground, real world barriers, and clearly this is what the gentleman's raising.
Yeah. Development needs energy, but energy does not need carbon, and that's the critical thing. And Africa has, and the rest of the world, but particularly Africa, because it's building its infrastructure for the future, has this real opportunity to do things differently. So as your question says, how do you grasp that opportunity? The conditions for investment are confidence in being able to sell. If you're an electricity generator, will you be able to sell? To whom will you be able to sell? What does that institution look like? Are there any kind of guarantees in the prices? So helping build the grid system so that it can accept this renewable energy is a big part of the story. But of course, much of Africa will not necessarily go straight for a grid system. So a lot of decentralized solar, I think, will be important with the kind of microfinance that can be necessary to that. And then you don't need the grid. You can do it yourself. You can do it in a household or a village. And I think taking those things forward, a lot of experience on microfinance for decentralized solar in India. A lot of that, by the way, is very good for gender issues because often it's the women who are staying at home and they can look after the decentralized solar and make some money that way. So it's creating the conditions for the grid, creating the conditions for the decentralized solar. There's quite a lot of experience there, but it needs a country to say this is what we want, and it needs the African Development Bank or the World Bank to come in and say, we can help you put those conditions together. And it needs, critically, the private sector investors to be part of that story and that design. But I think it is perfectly possible. We can see it. I'm not pretending it's easy, but these are the kind of things that we have to do, and quickly, yeah?
Yeah. Yes, please.
A few observations about Africa. I think some of the Chinese investors pay a lot of attention to investment in Africa, especially under the initiative of Silk Road.
Right.
One observation is that Nick emphasized the infrastructure. For the energy sector, most important infrastructure is electricity grid. But in Africa, you not have a good enough grid, especially cross-border, cross-country grid. Yeah. So if we invest solar energy and wind energy, it's very local. It cannot, formulate the stable electricity supply. Yeah. So this is that's a big problem. For some of private investors from China, they also would like to invest in grid. But however, there is a lot of problem. That's the cross-country coordination. That's a single country like China usually cannot do that. Another is that some of the countries are different from one to another. Yeah. Some African countries show a pretty enthusiasm. The others got into debt difficulties, so they may have a different attitude to this kind of infrastructure. So I think for the World Bank, for IMF, not only try to organize the funding for this kind of infrastructure, but also play a key role for cross-country, for continental coordination for that. Yeah. So we also see some of the African countries have abundant of hydro resources. But that's, the single country cannot consume that much of electricity. So it's needed to have infrastructure of a grid to transport the electricity to the many neighbor countries. So I think one of the important matter is that's how the World Bank, the Africa Development Bank, and the other development financing organization can work together to consider the continental Africa grid project.
So yet again, we come back to the point that multilateral development banks have a huge role to play. Mr. Lee, just quickly so we can fit one more question in. Yeah. Yeah, quickly,
two observations in terms of crowding more investment into developing countries like Africa. The first one is public sector needs to take more risk because there is a market failure there. Given the market failure, who can provide the de-risking arrangement? It's public sector, including MDB, IFIs. You know, the kind of guarantee, the kind of insurance provided by the public sector in order to make the investment attractive to private investors. So that's first, public sector needs to take more risk. The second is that we need more equity. We need more equity because right now there is too much debt everywhere, too much debt everywhere. There are many developing countries that simply cannot take more debt, even for climate. Right. So we need more equity. And this equity may have to come from public sector, at least partially. So IFI, MDBs, we need to think about how to work with, including DFIs, how the international community, the international public sector, come up with that kind of equity so that we can crowd in more private capital.
Yeah, yeah,
Those
yeah.
two points.
Very good point. I think there was a gentleman down the front who had his hand up. Yep, I think it's just coming.
Thank you very much, and good morning. The name is Wale Edun, Minister of Finance, Nigeria. We have heard that we need to scale up, we need investment, and the IMF has explained how, at the macro level, they help countries to add on to their macro thinking the issue of climate change. And we also know that the barrier, a major barrier to investment and to attracting private capital is a pipeline of what I would call bankable, feasible projects. The IMF is helping at the macro. What kind of organization could bring the thought leadership and the assistance to build these pipelines of projects in these different countries such that they have something to present to attract capital? Thank you.
Who would like? Go.
It's a bit bigger than a pipeline. What you need is a whole program within which the individual investments emerge, and that we've stressed in the Songwei-Stern report, in this G20 report for on the MDBs. A central concept is the idea of the country platform, where the private sector, the MDBs and the IMF and the government get together to set out where the infrastructure should go, what kinds of investments are necessary, and what the long-term future looks like. Because investment is all about confidence, and you need the confidence to make those things happen. So setting out the country platform in that way, which is private sector, MDBs and IMF, and the country, is absolutely crucial. I'm sure your country can take the lead in doing that. And in that context, then the pipelines start to come through. But investment is about confidence, and that confidence comes from a clear idea of where things are going. And I think that's a fundamental role for those three getting together, where the African Development Bank and the World Bank can play a critical role as well. But it's got to come from you. You're in the Ministry of Finance in Nigeria. You start it. Yeah.
But that is a really interesting point. I mean, and since we're at COP28, I know we've only got a minute left, but you know, there is a push by a lot of veterans of the COP process to bring the multilateral development banks, the IMF, and other bodies into the process more here, which, and I don't know what you all think about that, but I wonder if it would help to actually to answer these sorts of questions. It sounds as though that is what is needed to get your program up and running, maybe.
Yeah, but their program, not my program.
Yeah, well, sorry, I mean the program you just mentioned. Sorry, Mr. Lee. Go.
Yes, I very much agree with Nick. The country needs a program, needs a plan, needs a clarity of policy, because the investor and market, they want to see what kind of policy you want to put into this place, to have the clarity that you guys are going to support this kind of investments. But in addition to that, you know, I have been to 6 countries this year who received the RSD funding. We go there with our partners, MDB partner, World Bank, you know, African Development Bank. We go there to think about how to overcome all the barriers. One of the things we do is we start with a PPF, a project preparation facility, typically led by MDB, like African Development Bank. We start with a PPF, but this PPF, we want everybody to contribute. The DFIs, the bilateral donors, the MDBs, including IMF, we contribute to that PPF. So it will be a multi-donor, multi-sector PPF, and it will focus not only on mitigation, but also adaptation. So we want to use that PPF as a starting point to build a pipeline, because it's called a project preparation facility, right? So the purpose of that PPF is to build that pipeline. But it's not a one-day process. It takes years. But we will have the first stage, we'll have the second stage. But as soon as we have the first stage, then we can talk about what kind of financing products, what kind of financing instruments we can use to support this kind of pipeline. So we are working together with MDBs, precisely working on this kind of pipeline.
Thank you so much. It's such an interesting conversation, and actually we could continue it for at least another hour, but unfortunately I'm getting the wind-up signal. We are actually just slightly over time, but thank you everybody so much for a really interesting conversation. Thank you for some excellent questions. Thank you.
Very nicely, thank you.